So I'm Ravish. That's my Twitter profile. Easiest way to get in touch with me at any point. Uh, a little bit about me. I'm a design partner at this agency called Uncommon. Uh, we guys basically do for design plus development as well for a lot of clients, primarily in India. So like these are some of the top clients. Like Mintra's first Android app, for example, was built by us, and a bunch of other things around the world. Uh, it's more like a collective. So you have a lot of people across the country, based in Hyderabad, Chandigarh, Ahmedabad, Bangalore, and I'm the only guy actually here in Delhi. Uh, Prior to this, I was actually the first employee at Haptic. How many of you have heard of Haptic? Awesome. So I joined them as the first employee, where for like 1.5 to 2 years that I was there, nobody knew of Haptic for obvious reasons. If they did recognize it, it'd be like, oh, that's a company with a cool hand logo, right? Uh, I did a bunch of things there. Like as the first employee, you can imagine I'm essentially, so I joined with the ambit of essentially writing the Android app. Uh, Simultaneously, I was doing a lot of the design for both Android and iOS. Uh, because we were a very small team almost throughout my time over there, I was also a product manager. Like, so the reason I got the title of product manager was it's vague enough to fit what I was doing, right? I left the company in December 2015 to essentially decide to focus on what I want to do instead of being the guy who's shoehorned into whatever they need me to do, right? Um, so I've started designing pretty much right after that. I kind of, with another friend, we tried to actually start a consultancy, but we kind of decided just to join Uncommon because these guys were doing some great work. They were already our friends, and we are like, why are we competing with these people instead of just working together with them, right? Uh, so today's thing is mostly about Framer itself, but in the beginning, I want to talk about why we should be prototyping in the first place, right? Uh, I've worked at a product company and I've worked with a lot of other clients, and by and far the biggest mistake I see a lot of them make is that someone in the company feels very strongly about an idea and decides to force it down the user's throats, which usually has bad results, right? Things don't work without testing them out first. Your ideas don't necessarily make sense to the person that you're actually dealing with. Uh, so one of the core research that IBM did years ago in user experience itself was they kind of talked about how every dollar spent on design and research saves you $10 in development costs and $100 in post maintenance, like post release maintenance. That's, I can't quite vouch for these exact numbers, but they make a ton of sense, right? You kind of decide that this feature is what we're going to work on. You spend so much development time, which is actually very expensive. Your programmers cost a lot of money. And once you release it, you're actually stuck with that, trying to get data back, and it takes you a long time to realize that your product is actually not working itself, right? Uh, so for that reason, prototyping is really important, according to me, in any sprint format that you guys use within your companies. Uh, there's actually another reason to prototype as well, which is essentially that you're trying to communicate with your engineers itself in terms of animation specifically, that how does a flow particularly work, right? Uh, However, today's thing is going to focus more on the first, and that's the way I look at prototyping more, which is for usability testing. Uh, Now, specifically, like before we get into Framer itself, I want to talk about some of the different design tools, the prototyping tools out there. So we are actually in what I can easily call the golden age of design tools, so to speak. Right? You have amazing tools when it comes to drawing up your wireframes, whether it be Sketch, InVision, sorry, not InVision, Affinity Designer, whether it be XD, whether it be Photoshop. But you also have like a ton of people creating really good prototyping tools for you. You have InVision, Marvel, you have uh, Pop has just actually been sold to Marvel itself. You have Proto, you have Framer, you have Principle, you have Pixate. Uh, I have actually gone through literally every one of them at some point or the other during my career, just trying to understand which one is the best right now. Uh, I actually touched upon Framer almost 2 years ago, largely because I have an engineering background and Framer was written in code. So I was like, hey, maybe this is something that really works well for me. Except it kind of slew me down a lot, right? Because you're writing code and it take a lot of time for you to do the things that you need to do. You're essentially creating a website and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of gave up on it back then, and I started spending a lot more time within InVision and Marvel. So InVision and Marvel work brilliantly well if all you're doing is testing out your flows, right? My golden rule, in a sense, for prototyping in general is you want to spend the minimum amount of time, just do just about enough to test out whatever your hypothesis is in general, right? More often than not, you're testing out flows. So Marvel and InVision work perfectly. But what happens is you might be doing some things which require you to really dive deep into a high fidelity prototype, right? Which looks like a real application in itself. I actually spent some time trying to create prototypes with native Android code when I would be doing things. Obviously, that would take quite a bit of time. I finally decided last year to move back to Framer to give it another shot when I was doing this research called Designing for the Next Billion. Just to give you a bit of background on that, I kind of realized that a lot of Indian users, specifically users who are coming online for the first time, could not use the products that we build out the same way that the other people build it, right? Because for one, they have never really used a computer in their life. So things that we take for granted, they have no idea about. They've never particularly used a mouse in their life, for example. They've never really hovered over a particular screen and all that kind of stuff. Uh, and when I want to test things out with them, at first I thought, let's just do a simple Marvel or InVision kind of stuff. Except that was really faking it, right? Because all I could do was maybe test out tabs and take things through. But I really wanted to test out a lot of other things that made them feel like these are real prototypes that they might end up using. Uh, for that reason, I decided to give Framer another try to test out some really high fidelity prototypes. An example of that is this one over here. So, uh, this is essentially the Android lock screen. All of you are probably used to this. Uh, and one of the things that I wanted to test with this was, do these people understand how to unlock this device, right? So if I was to give a new person who's never used a smartphone in their life this screen, would they be able to unlock it? Guess what? They could not, because the stuff over here, the affordances are so delicate that they've never really used it. They're very used to those buttons that they kind of tap on unlock and all that kind of stuff. But what I wanted still was to give them the real experience, which is something like this. So if they had to drag and drop, this would kind of move like a real prototype in itself, right? So these are the things that Framer makes possible really well, because you're writing code and you can make these things happen. So you can build in those relationships between swipes and other things with specific objects in there. The question that a lot of people ask me about this is, why didn't I just go with Principle, right? Because Principle allows you to do a lot of these things itself. Uh, my personal belief about usability testing is that the testing device that a person uses should be as close to the device that they're actually going to be using, right? So when I was testing this out with them, I would actually use a Nexus 5 that I own, which actually has like a busted screen slightly that has a crack over it. So it just makes them feel like this is a device that they can actually own. The moment I give them an iPhone, because Principle only works on an iPhone, uh, they might just start looking at it very differently, right? You need to connect with your users, which is why I went with this. Secondly, is the fact that essentially you can do a lot of things with Framer once you get used to the code in itself uh, fairly easily. So I had to create like variants of this prototype very quickly that I was able to do so easily. So I could create modules and just repeat them across different things. Okay. So today we're going to go through and create like a very simple prototype from a sketch file. I'm going to show you how to do it. If you want to follow along, feel free to. This link over here contains what is essentially called a code lab, which contains all the files that we're going to use. How many of you have ever done a code lab in your life? Okay. So code labs are very common amongst engineers essentially, right? And we are writing code. Uh, so what that essentially does is you have step-by-step process of going through things and seeing like how things change between each step itself. It's on GitHub right now. So sorry. So from this link, you can follow along later if you want, for example. But if you want the link, it's essentially this, which is bit.ly/IxDA Gurgaon Feb, right? You can download the sketch file. In step one, what we're going to do is we're going to import the sketch file into Framer itself. This alone was one of the major reasons I actually went back to Framer, because previously what we had to do was we would create all our different layers. We would export them as PNGs and we would position them inside Framer itself, the HTML code that we used to write itself used to take so much time that it was just like, yeah, I'm not going to do this for my work. Right? In step 2, what we're going to do is I'm going to show you a bit about layers and how they work. How can you modify their properties and stuff like that? How many of you write CSS or can understand CSS? Okay. So CSS is essentially used for HTML, like for your websites, to essentially set their properties. So you can set colors, position, and other kind of things. It's actually very simple. Okay. Uh, in step 3, we're going to start doing some kind of events, which is going to be like, what should it happen if I was to tap here, if I was to drag here, and things like that. In step 4, we're going to do something called states. We'll go over these again. And the fifth one is finally going to be, which is going to be more for the programmers, which is using loops. So like showing how you can get to an advanced state within Framer itself. Okay, so this is the sketch file in itself. It's a very simple to do application, like just very generic. Let me just zoom in over here. So you have essentially like a list of to do tasks that I have over here. If you see over here, there's like 30 of them, which I've used like InVision's duplicate functionality to create them. And there's this fab over here, the floating action button, which allows me to essentially just create a new one. This is the detail screen that I've really not bothered to do much with. It's just meant to show that when I'm going to tap on this plus button, it should just open up this detail screen where I can create the thing, right? Now, if I was to create an InVision prototype of this, the only thing I could probably do was do a scroll and probably move between the two of them, right? Like from here to there. If I wanted to show, for example, how you can have a check mark, what I would do is probably have like one hotspot on one of them or maybe on all the tasks. And what I'd do is probably take me to another screen which would show just one random one check mark because I've decided that that's how I'm going to communicate to people that this one has been check marked. Guess what? That doesn't work well in real world tests, right? Because when you go and show a person this, the first question they ask when they see such a low fidelity prototype is, but I tapped this one. Why is this one green, right? So it makes them feel like they're part of a test and does not make them feel like they're using a real world tool itself. So for you guys, you just have to download this and you would open up Framer over here. So the first step, like I said, is essentially importing your sketch file, right? So all you have to do is go to import over here and it shows this thing over here, which is like you can import your sketch file, you can import your Figma file or your Photoshop file. You want to choose the scale that you want based on the device that you're going to be using. One of the concerns with Framer is that it's very pixel based, so you want to scale it up to the device that you're probably going to use for your testing. Nowadays, it's most likely going to be 3x. Fortunately, like most people are using your 1080p screens, so I'm just going to go to 3x and import. And what this essentially does is takes my artboards from here and imports them over here, as you can see. So this is my detail screen, which is the one on the right. It's a little hidden right now. And this is my home screen. And you can see all these different layers that I have over here, right? One of the key things to understand about Framer, however, is that it only imports and shows you layers over here, which you can select if they are groups themselves. If they're not groups, you can't really do much with them. I kind of wish they would start using symbols in that same way, which is one of the limitations in my opinion, because now, for example, if you come over here, tasks is a group in itself, but I can't actually choose one of the individual tasks underneath them. So as you can see over here, they're all symbols. It just flattens them out into one single PNG and just adds them entirely over there. But for now, that's kind of fine. The next thing obviously is for me is to now make this scrollable. Now, the good thing for something like InVision and Marvel is that this would have been very easy. You just drag these things up from the bottom. It's not that complicated when you're doing it in Framer. So to create a scroll, you have essentially something called a scroll component. Okay. Again, might sound complicated, but it's fairly simple. So all I do is like create a variable. I'm just going to call it scroll and do scroll component dot wrap. And now what I want to do is select the layer that I want to wrap. What this does is if I can select this particular layer, it is going to just take its all components and just make that scrollable for me. So this is going to be sketch.tasks. Tasks is this one over here. So now this entire thing, as you can see, is scrollable. One of the concerns with this is obviously the fact that when I do this, it takes it wrap and it actually moves this right to the top over here. This can be kind of annoying. Uh, Now is when you can start doing some of the stuff with it. So like what I will do is sorry, scroll dot place behind. Sorry. Okay. So two lines of code essentially to move this and position it properly over here, right? The first line over here is essentially that it's taking this component and putting it as a child of another layer over here. So the layer that I wanted was a screen layer, right? It's kind of, again, it takes a bit of work, but once you get used to it, this is just something that comes very naturally to you. Uh, when I do that, it typically adds a child to the first index within its element. So that's why I have to add this other thing over here, which is like placed behind the status bar. If I was to remove this, it's still in front of all of these elements, right? Now, another thing that you want to learn about, so these are all things over here called layers, right? Uh, you can also set the CSS properties if you want, which can be like positions and other things. So for example, say if I want the fab to not be at the right, I kind of realize that the right is not working particularly well for my users on the fly. This might be because they're trying to check one of the tasks off and they would by mistake tap on this plus button. Uh, what I can do is select the fab and set the properties over here, and over here I can essentially set its different uh, value for it. So it can be 100, for example. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Sure. Yes, so that might happen if you don't have a device selected. Sorry, didn't mention that. Right over here, you have a device option. So I'm using the Pixel. Is it working now? Yeah, so that's what I showed earlier, where you have to set it to 3x when you're doing the import. Sure. Yeah, so one of the good things is the documentation for Framer comes with Framer Studio itself. So if I just hit Command D, all the stuff is right over here. So if you want to search for anything at any point that you are not sure about, you can actually just come here and go through it. So uh, right from here, for example, you can go into more on layers. So as you can see over here, this is the CSS properties being set over here. Right? So this is them creating a layer in itself. You can take any layer and change its properties. So for example, they're taking layer.x and setting it to 200, things like that. So this is what I did over here, which is like took sketch.fab and set the x to 100, right? So you can move it about. So say if I want it in the middle, I'll just set it approximately to 456. So now it's right in the middle. So this is like something that you might see quite often on different applications where the right side of the list has a tappable element and they want to kind of avoid the fab from coming over it. Uh, an example is Android's dialer screen. So when you go into the contacts, it kind of moves the fab to the middle so that you can just avoid tapping over certain things. So this is how you can modify a bunch of layers in different ways. So if I want to do another thing, which is like set sketch.fab dot scale to 3, I can increase its size. If I want to set it to 0.3, I can decrease its size, right? So you have essentially all the CSS elements for this. You can move it about as required without having to go back into your sketch file and modifying each and every time for these things. Okay, so for now, I'm just going to keep it in the middle. Let's move to the next one, which is add some tap events as well as introduce flow components. So the point of this is now that uh, flow component is actually a fairly recent addition to Framer itself. Uh, for the longest time, Framer required you to move around pages yourself significantly on your own. So if you see some of my old prototypes, the ones that I use for designing for the next billion, these different screens were literally me moving the screens about themselves, which would have been so much easier on something like InVision and Marvel, where I can say that a tap here or a drag there is just going to take me from this screen to this screen. Flow component finally brings that to Framer itself. Uh, Let me just move to the step itself. So this is the code for flow component. You're essentially creating a new flow component over here. Let me see if I can. Are you able to see this code or not? I'm just seeing if I can change the font size somehow. Yeah, 1 second. Yeah. Ah, sorry about that. Okay. So this is the flow component over here, where you essentially, what it does is when you create a flow component, it takes each screen as a flow itself. So if I was to essentially remove this code at the bottom, it creates a blank. So it no longer takes the first artboard and puts it there itself. Uh, it now leaves a control over me in terms of which artboard do I want to show. So the code for that is essentially flow.show next, and you give it the artboard name, and the false or true over here is whether or not you want to animate this. So the first one, for example, I don't want to animate because the moment they come in, I just want to show them the artboard on its own. Uh, Once I do that, I can just take the sketch.fab.onTap. So an ontap is essentially one of the events that we use, right? So you have a bunch of different ones for that. So if I can show you a few, sketch.on. So you have on pan, on drag, on halt, on move, on stop, on click, on pan up, on pinch. So like whichever kind of gestures or events that you want to catch. And all you're doing after that is telling the flow component to essentially go to the next screen itself, right? Uh, Actually, don't need this little bit here. So once I have this, what essentially happens is it goes to the next screen, right? This is why if I just have show next over here as sketch or detail without having anything, by default, the show next function takes true, which means it's going to animate. If I was to change this to false, it shouldn't do. Okay, it's not supposed to be doing that. Sorry about that. Okay, so it has that. One of the additional things that I've done is created a menu layer over here. So if I have to create a hotspot, the unfortunate fact is you either have a layer that you've created from before that you can catch. However, I created a layer on my own just to show you how you can do that. The layer is called menu. The Y and all is set over here to essentially be 72, which is from the top over here. Height is 167, and opacity is 0 to essentially just make it completely transparent. So this layer is actually over here. So if I just select it here, it shows you these bounds over here. So whenever you select your menu actually over here, like you create a layer inside of your code, you can actually change its properties right from here, right? So again, if you're not very comfortable with writing your own code, you can actually modify a lot of these things right inside Frame itself. So uh, the position, the size, the background. So if I want to change the background, I can do that. If I was to increase the opacity completely, now you can see it. I can change its color as required. Uh, the reason its opacity is 0 is because I actually don't want it to be visible. I just want it to be able to catch this event. So now if menu.onTap flow.show previous, which is essentially go back. So I come here. I have the flow working as you would expect. Uh, Next up is going to be like we're going to use something called states. So what kind of happens quite often is like changing some of these properties just requires us to do a lot of work, which is essentially that we're going to toggle between multiple states for a lot of tasks, right? So for example, when you have check marks, it's going to be like, well, I have this check mark, why should I keep changing its properties each and every time? So you can define states from before. And what I'm going to use to show that is not going to be the check mark itself, but something I showed earlier, which is called scale. So a lot of the applications that you use, like what they usually do is when you start scrolling the content, the fab on top disappears or just decreases in size, or it kind of becomes invisible. The reason for that is because essentially you don't want this element to be visible anymore. The user is now more focused on the content behind. So what I do for this is I'm going to detect when the scroll component is scrolling itself. When it's scrolling down, I want the fab to disappear. When the user's coming back up, I want it to reappear. So the states can be defined like this. So it's sketch.fab.states.hidden, and I give it a scale of 0, and I can give it the animation options that I want of my own. So if I want a different kind of curve, so by default it uses an ease curve. In this one, I just want to give it like a bounce effect. I'm doing that. And I can set the time on its own. So the time again is actually, I think, almost like 1 or 2 seconds. So that default animations take very long. Uh, the easier way to do states actually is going to be just select the layer that you want to modify. So in this case, it's going to be the fab over here. I can right click on it. I can either edit the state, which has been created here by itself, or I can actually add a state over here. So when I do this, it kind of creates the code on its own, gives it a name by itself, and I can change its properties. So I can be like scale is 2, or I can change its color to something else. So if I want, sorry, not the background, I can change this position to 500, right? Uh, what I'm doing, I'm not going to actually use that one. What I'm going to use is the hidden and default one itself. I'm also catching this event over here, which is scroll.onScroll. So when this scrolls, you can see how it just decreases on its own, right? So again, a bit of code in this, which is essentially that scroll.scroll_y is it like the scroll.scroll_y gives me the current y position of the scroll component itself, right? I have the default one written over here under current scroll, which is by default going to be 0. I know from this case that the scroll y position is greater than the current one, which means the user has actually moved down, right? As soon as that happens, I wanted to change to this position state called to hidden. Uh, Another thing that you can do is use a thing called switch state, which will basically avoid the animation if you want to avoid it, right? So in case you want to be like, hey, this user has ended up in this state coming back from a previous screen and you just want to change this position, you can do that. I'm just going to keep it as animate. If it's else, which is essentially that the scroll y position is lower than the current scroll, that essentially means that the user has moved back up. And I'm just updating the current scroll simultaneously all the time. So this allows me to essentially do this over here. Now I could have changed this from hidden to say something like A, right? Which is the one I just showed you how to create. So if I do this, you can see how the scale is changing and all of these kind of things. So your states essentially allow you to do a bunch of different things that you need it to do. Really useful if you've got a lot of different states for your elements. You're going to use it for your buttons all the time to show maybe a hover state, on click state, maybe what do you call it? When you have removed it, like when it cannot be clicked and that kind of stuff. Now, the final thing that I'm going to show is actually a little more complicated for most people, but I kind of enjoyed it because it kind of just shows the possibility of Framer really well, which is essentially using loops now. So over here, what I've done is the first thing, like I talked about how it's really complicated to get all the tasks as separate elements in itself, right? So what I usually do to make my life easier while doing this is I will go back into Sketch and I will go into the symbols, and the symbols that I want to be turned into groups so that I can actually use them, I'm just going to delete them for myself. So it's going to be like checkbox complete and tasks. If I delete, Sketch asks me, do I want to turn these like do I want to delete these symbols? And what it does by default is turns them back into groups for me, right? So once I do this delete, I can come back over here and re-import the sketch file for myself. So it's going to use the same stuff from before. It's just going to create all those task elements, as you can see over here, into individual groups and layers that I can modify on my own. What I can then do on top of that is now getting into some real bit of code, which is use something called a for loop. So how many of you know what a for loop is? Okay, awesome. So for loop is essentially like one of the basics things in programming. It essentially allows you to loop through a collection, which is essentially an array in this case. Sketch.task.children gives us an array. So that an array is going to be the children of all of its elements. So if I was to, for example, just do like print sketch.tasks.children, you can see all of these things over here. So not very clear, but you can essentially see it's printing out each and every element that I have in there for me. So it's giving me the name, which is task 13, task 9. It's giving me its positions and all that kind of stuff. This is a fairly simple for loop that you can use inside of Framer itself, where it's essentially saying in each loop, take the child at that particular index, and then I can do whatever I want with it. So in this case, I'm taking the check is equal to layer.children 0. Now children itself is because I want to catch only the specific checkbox. I don't want it to be a case that they can tap anywhere on the screen on that element and check an item off. I want it to only be the checkbox. So this way, I'm catching each and every checkbox and turning it into this variable here called check. I'm creating states, which is called incomplete, in which case I'm saturating it to 0, which is how I'm getting the gray. And I'm creating another one, which is called complete. I'm just setting the saturation to 100, and which is when I'll get green. I'm here doing the state switch, which is, like I mentioned, is how you essentially move to a particular state without any animation. So if I was not to do this, like if I was to remove this, you can see all of these are now green over here, right? Because it's not actually gone into the incomplete mode. If I was to do something like animate, it just animates all of those changes happening over there. I don't want that animation, so I'm just going to do state switch. Another thing that I'm doing here is every time you tap on this particular check, I want to take that layer and I want to actually cycle the state between two different states right now. So this means I don't actually have to bother myself with the logic of them. I don't have to keep variables somewhere being like, okay, what is its current state? What is its different one? Framer is going to do that for me itself. So essentially what I'm doing is every time someone taps on a particular state, it's going to cycle between these two, right? Another thing just to explain over here is this is actually slightly different from the previous taps that you saw, which was on tap. The reason I have to do it like this is because I actually want the event to pass back the layer specifically to me. If I was to use on tap, what ends up happening is it would always return the last checkbox that I use. So what would end up happening in that prototype is that the last layer is the one that would repeatedly keep toggling between the two. So this gives me each and every time that specific layer that has been checked. I don't have to bother about any logic or any overriding going on over there. And this just means now I can toggle between the two of them, which is, so this is green, that's right. So just to show you how that wouldn't work earlier, if I was to do this, so all of these are now this, I tap here, it hasn't turned green, but if I go to the bottom, wait, yeah, sorry. Yeah, because layer itself doesn't exist at this point, sorry. This last one, as you can see, has turned green, right? Because what's happening is that it's just taking the last layer that set as check and setting the properties to that. It doesn't maintain those specific layers that have essentially been tapped. Okay, so that's essentially the prototype that I've created for you guys. Some of the things I want to talk about, some of the major advantages of Framer itself, for example, is the fact that there's a huge community behind it, right? So you have people all over the world on Slack and Facebook groups itself, which are creating components that you can reuse in your code itself. An example of this is actually a prototype that I created with the folks at Gojek recently. Let me just show that. So we're just working on like a chat component for them, right? Uh, One of the things that we wanted to do was, this is a chat component, and what we wanted was a message to come here. And when we are testing it out with these people, we wanted them to somehow get to know that a message has actually come. So how do we do that? We want a notification sound to come. That unfortunately does not work on InVision or Marvel as far as I know itself. Definitely not on InVision. So one of the founders of Framer has actually created this audio player module itself, which allows me to play audios wherever I want. So what will happen is, the moment I just so I don't have the sound on. Sorry. Yeah, sound's not working. So, but essentially, it plays the audio for me over here. So you can see the logic over here on the left, which is essentially Chats.ontap. The reason, okay, just to explain Chats.ontap, on Framer's own prototype, I don't necessarily need this, but I use a different tool for myself. Uh, the current Chrome browser essentially blocks you from playing audio without a user's actual interaction itself. So the idea was, hey, we can just do a tap to set up the prototype. It's going to just play the audio and pause it immediately. And then after 10-second delay, it is going to actually get the new chat to come in. It is going to get the driver arrived opacity to be 1, which is the last message that is there. It's going to scroll to that particular layer. And then if play, which is like if we are in the play state right now, it should just play the sound for me. So again, why is this if play here? Because what was happening was, if we were not to do this, anytime we would scroll or tap, it would repeatedly start the 10-second component all over again. It would do the entire thing all over again. So we were just getting repeated things. This just kind of shows you the kind of prototypes you can create with Framer being way more than what you can do on your normal things. Another person I know at Dropbox, for example, created a variation of this sound which kind of mimics a vibration effect in itself. Right, so it doesn't actually vibrate your phone, but if you're testing it out on your Mac or something like that, the sound it makes is just like a vibration. So you can mimic those things over there. Uh, Framer is completely JavaScript based, although it uses like a subsection of it called CoffeeScript. Uh, they are considering moving to ECMA, which is like the latest version of JavaScript, like ECMA 6, which should make things a lot easier, because right now we're kind of limited in terms of some of the capabilities of this. Uh, but essentially, like, the code that you write in this is fairly less, right? So as you can see, it's this one over here is 30 lines of it, and most of it is just imports and setting the proper properties. Uh, Let me show another. So this is the one that I showed earlier, which is doing all the states. Sorry, the unlock screen. This is less than 50 lines of code over here, right? Uh, One of the things that a lot of designers actually talk about is how using Framer, particularly with this new autocode functionality, it actually makes life a lot simpler for them, in the sense that they actually learn how to code itself, because you're doing a lot of things in the middle with these layers, and you kind of start understanding how these things are happening for itself. You can get really complicated with Framer once you get to later stages. Like, for example, Dhruv at Uncommon, he is really good at this. So uh, if I was to show one of his prototypes, this is one that he created. So this has a lot of complicated stuff from programming going on. It has classes being created, it has layers being set and all, but the effects are just fantastic. So if you have a check mark, so I was essentially spending all my night last night looking at his code and trying to understand what exactly he's done. Every Framer prototype that you share out to the community actually has the ability to have this thing over here called Open in Framer. So anyone who wants to look into your code can actually go in and look into your code itself, which is why this has been picking up so well. Another reason why this is really good for when you're working with developers versus something like Principal is you don't have to spend your own time documenting your uh, stuff itself, right? Otherwise, you're kind of pointing out to them in some kind of written form that the damping effect should be this, the curve should be this, there should be this much time, this is the way it should move. Uh, a programmer can easily go into your stuff and actually just read out exactly what you've done. And he's actually written a blog post about some of the best practices for this. Okay. Just quickly mentioning, this is the blog that I was talking about. This is the best tip that I saw in it entirely, which is like the idea of writing very elaborate pseudocode itself. Because, like I mentioned, writing Framer code is actually fairly simple, logical things. Once you write pseudocode, it just makes your life easier and makes it easier for the developer to understand as well. So, if you run into any issues, you can always find someone else to logically explain to you how you can do this on its own.